So imagine you're building this massive multi-million rand distribution center, right?
Okay.
But instead of, actually laying down a permanent reinforced concrete foundation, your procurement team decides to just rent the bricks.
Rent the bricks.
Yeah, rent them day by day based on whatever the local hardware store happens to be charging that specific morning.
Oh, wow. I mean, that sounds completely absurd.
Right. It's an absurd way to build something that obviously requires absolute stability. But if you actually look under the hood of most South African supply chains right now, I mean, that is the exact methodology driving their transport operations.
Yeah, that analogy actually captures the core dysfunction perfectly. You're basically attempting to build this reliable, totally predictable operational machine, but using a sourcing foundation that is, well, that's intentionally designed to be fluid and temporary.
Exactly.
It's just hyper-reactive to whatever the daily conditions are.
And for you listening, the professionals out there actively navigating the South African transport and logistics industry, that daily reactivity is, well, it's likely your defining reality.
Right. It's what you live every day.
Yeah. So our mission for today's deep dive is to unpack a set of really profound insights from Greystride. We're looking specifically at their research into why transport sourcing in this environment, why it so consistently devolves into this just exhausting cycle of constantly putting out fires.
Yeah, and the goal here isn't just to, validate that frustration, though it is very valid.
Absolutely.
But we really want to dissect the actual mechanics of it.
Yeah.
And to do that effectively, we have to look way past the symptoms.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when a supply chain breaks down, the immediate instinct is always to focus on the point of failure, right?
Oh, wait.
It's the delayed truck, or the sudden rate hike, or the fact that capacity just vanished right when you needed it.
Right, and we end up treating logistics like it's this unpredictable force of nature that we just have to kind of hunker down and survive.
Yeah.
But Greystride's analysis demands a structural review. We need to look at how that transport capacity is being acquired in the very first place, rather than just endlessly diagnosing the operational fallout.
So let's start by looking at what I like to call the universal cover story.
The universal cover story, I like that.
Because when you are managing a logistics network and, say, a collection is delayed by 8 hours, or your transport spend just jumps significantly over a single quarter, the default response from almost every stakeholder is literally always the same.
Yeah, it's always, well, the market is exceptionally difficult right now.
Exactly. The market is difficult.
It's the ultimate industry catch-all. And, I mean, to analyze this fairly, we definitely must acknowledge the legitimate pressures within the South African logistics landscape.
Sure.
Because the environment is objectively incredibly harsh right now. Operating costs aren't just rising, they're basically compounding.
Right. You've got fuel volatility, which is crazy.
Yeah, fuel volatility, escalating maintenance costs because of, well, obvious infrastructure challenges.
Goal increase.
Exactly. The absolute baseline cost of just keeping a commercial vehicle compliant and physically on the road is fundamentally much higher today than it was even, say, 2 years ago.
And then you add to that the fluidity of capacity, right?
Yeah.
We see trucks shifting massively between sectors.
All the time.
It's based on seasonal agricultural demands, or you get these sudden spikes in mining exports that just end up pulling flat decks out of the FMCG pool entirely. So the broader macroeconomic weather, so to speak, is undeniably rough.
Oh, the pressures are very real. I mean, every player from a single owner-operator all the way up to a massive enterprise-level load provider is operating under that exact same dense cloud cover. So the operating environment provides this very convincing, very real backdrop of difficulty.
And here's where we have to apply a bit of analytical pressure. If every logistics manager and every procurement officer and every fleet operator is dealing with the exact same macroeconomic weather,
right,
why do some freight networks just constantly hemorrhage capital and miss their service level agreements while others somehow maintain complete stability?
And that discrepancy right there is the exact entry point into Greystride's core thesis.
Because if it were purely just the external market dictating all the outcomes, then every load provider would suffer equally.
Exactly. The pain would be totally evenly distributed.
Yeah, but it's not.
No, it's not. Furthermore, we see companies constantly swapping out their variables. Like, they'll change their primary lanes, they adjust their volumes, they might even fire their entire vendor base and bring in a totally fresh set of transporters.
A clean slate.
Right, a clean slate. Yet, 6 months later, where are they? sitting in the exact same boardroom, staring at the exact same metrics of delayed collections and vanished capacity.
Wow, so it's not the variables, it's the constant.
Exactly. Those broader market conditions act as a highly effective smokescreen.
Yeah.
Because the market is genuinely difficult, it provides this very convenient, universally accepted cover story that basically masks the structural root cause of the failures.
So the external volatility is really just a catalyst.
Yes, the actual vulnerability lies in the foundational method load providers are using to secure their transport.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because the Greystride material points the finger directly at one specific structural flaw, and that's the heavy reliance on purely transactional sourcing.
Transactional sourcing, yes.
Basically treating transport as a spot market procurement activity. You request a rate, you allocate a load, you just consider the job done.
And that transactional model completely dominates the industry right now. I mean, from a pure procurement perspective, the appeal is completely logical.
Sure, it promises ultimate freedom.
Exactly. You avoid being locked into fixed assets, you aren't tied to these long-term agreements, and theoretically, you can tap into the entire open market to find the absolute lowest rate available on, say, any given Tuesday.
But let's look at the internal corporate mechanics driving that, because obviously this doesn't just happen in a vacuum. If I'm sitting in a procurement seat, my entire performance dashboard is likely built around driving down the immediate cost per load.
Right, your KPIs.
Yeah, my standard KPIs actively incentivize me to jump onto the spot market, play 3 transporters against each other, and secure a rate that's like 5% cheaper than yesterday.
Yeah.
And on paper, I look like a hero. I am delivering massive value to the company.
Well, what's fascinating here is that you are delivering a very specific type of value. It's short-term, isolated cost savings.
Okay.
The paradox that Greystride highlights is that these standard procurement KPIs are frequently at total war with long-term operational stability.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. By optimizing purely for today's cheapest rate, you are actively dismantling your network's overall resilience. So the flexibility that transactional sourcing promises actually breeds this severe hidden dependency.
Okay, I really want to break down that concept, because flexibility creating dependency seems entirely counterintuitive. How does having access to, hundreds of transporters make me more dependent?
It comes down to the mechanics of leverage and alignment. When you source transactionally, you are not really building a supply chain. You're simply buying isolated moments of capacity.
It's like relying on random rideshare apps for your vital daily commute instead of just getting a dedicated vehicle.
Yes, that's a great way to think about it. You become entirely dependent on the immediate daily whims of the spot market. If capacity tightens up because, say, there's a huge export surge, you have absolutely no dedicated alignment to protect your freight.
Because you didn't commit to them, they don't commit to you.
Exactly. You are completely reliant on whoever happens to be available, rather than building a sustainable model that's actually designed to guarantee your operations for tomorrow.
And we can trace exactly what that looks like when the pressure actually hits. Greystride points to this phenomenon known as the tender rejection cascade.
Oh, the cascade, yes.
Let's say you have a routing guide, right?
Yeah.
And your primary spot carrier rejects a load because, well, they found a more lucrative ad hoc job somewhere else.
Which is a very, very common scenario when there's no real long-term alignment binding that carrier to your network.
Yeah, so the load falls to the second carrier on your list, who also rejects it because their capacity is suddenly tight. By the time that load hits the 4th or 5th carrier on your routing guide, you are no longer in any position to negotiate. You just need that freight off your dock immediately.
You're desperate.
Exactly. And you end up paying a massive premium, sometimes 30 or 40% above the baseline, just to secure a truck. So the initial savings your procurement team fought so hard for on Monday are completely wiped out by the tender rejection cascade on Thursday.
That cascade perfectly illustrates the fundamental shift in the locus of control. Over time, a purely transactional approach strips all the leverage away from the load provider. You are no longer managing your capacity. The market's daily volatility is literally managing you.
Because there's zero mutual investment there.
None.
If you're only interacting with a transporter based on today's lowest bid, they have absolutely no incentive to prioritize your freight when the market inevitably tightens up. Their loyalty extends only as far as that current transaction.
And the cascading effects of that loss control are entirely systemic. First of all, your freight network becomes virtually impossible to optimize.
Because you don't have the data.
Exactly. Optimization requires predictable data. If your rates and your capacity are fluctuating wildly based on these daily spot market reactions, you cannot accurately budget for logistics. Nor can you plan any strategic growth. You're effectively flying blind.
Forecasting based on historical guesses.
Right,
Yeah.
instead of secured capacity. And taking that a step further, your ability to enforce performance standards just completely evaporates. Service level agreements, your SLAs, they are meaningless if you're utilizing a revolving door of transporters.
Right, because how can you drive continuous improvement or mandate specific safety standards when your supplier base changes week to week?
You can't. It just changes based on who offered the cheapest rate that morning. It creates an environment of total opacity. And honestly, this is why logistics costs become so incredibly difficult to explain to internal stakeholders or to the C-suite.
Oh man, I can just visualize those executive meetings. The board asks why logistics spend is over budget by millions of rand for the quarter. And the logistics manager, they can't point to a single catastrophic failure, so they just fall back on the smokescreen.
The market was volatile.
Exactly. The market was volatile.
Yeah.
But a board won't accept the weather report as a long-term strategy.
And they shouldn't. Greystride argues that under a transactional structure, severe unpredictability simply becomes the accepted operational baseline. It gets fully baked into the daily expectations of the logistics team. They literally stop expecting the system to work smoothly, and they just start expecting it to fail.
Okay, but if the underlying structure is actively burning capital, ruining service levels, and stripping away all this control, why isn't it glaringly obvious to everyone involved? Like, if the foundation of your multi-million rand distribution center is physically crumbling, why is the industry still renting bricks?
That's the million-dollar question, and the answer is because the failure doesn't look like a sudden collapse. If the entire South African transport network structurally failed on a single Tuesday, load providers would immediately recognize the systemic flaw and they'd overhaul their procurement models. But the risk rarely manifests as a spectacular, system-breaking event.
Right. It's not the warehouse burning down. It's much more insidious than that.
Greystride identifies this dynamic as death by 1,000 cuts.
Death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah. The structural flaw disguises itself as just small, recurring frictions. It diffuses the pain across hundreds of daily microfailures rather than one massive crisis.
So let's translate that small recurring friction into the daily reality of the professionals listening right now.
Yeah.
What does that actually look like on the operations floor?
It takes the form of just a relentless administrative burden. It's the transporter who fails to provide a location update, so it requires 3 separate follow-up calls. It's the capacity utilization suddenly dropping because a random spot truck arrived with the entirely wrong trailer configuration for your loading dock. Or it's a sudden, unbudgeted route surcharge that requires a 20-minute email negotiation just to resolve.
Or it's the wild inconsistency in service levels. Like, one week, a load is executed flawlessly because you happen to secure a highly professional operator on the spot market.
Right.
But the very next week, your customer is absolutely furious because the load was handed off to a subcontractor with failing equipment, and you had zero visibility into that handover.
Exactly. And the trap here is that individually, each of these small frictions appears highly manageable.
Sure.
When a location update is missed, a logistics coordinator simply sends a WhatsApp message to chase it down.
No big deal.
Right. When a trailer configuration is wrong, the warehouse manager just works around it. When a rate dispute occurs, an email thread resolves it. The operations team internalizes all of these frictions as just, well, part of the job.
But that normalization is so dangerous. Because individually, yeah, resolving a late truck takes 10 minutes. But collectively, when you aggregate those quote-unquote manageable frictions across hundreds of loads per week, it creates this massive operational black hole.
A huge black hole.
It just consumes the time, the energy, and the intellect of your highest performing team members.
Consider the opportunity cost. I mean, we really have to ask how much time logistics teams are actually spending on freight network optimization or analyzing lane density or actually developing strategic capacity partnerships for the next fiscal year.
In a transactional environment, the answer is almost zero.
Almost zero. Because the friction forces them into a permanent reactionary posture. Greystride draws a really sharp distinction here. They point out that these teams are no longer managing a supply chain at all.
What are they doing?
They are merely managing movement. They're playing this endless game of operational whack-a-mole, just making highly pressurized tactical decisions hour by hour simply to clear the dock today.
Wow. Managing movement instead of managing the supply chain.
Hmm.
And doing so essentially guarantees they're going to face the exact same chaotic environment tomorrow.
Exactly.
And the psychological toll of that cycle is immense.
Mhm.
You are asking highly trained supply chain professionals to basically function as high-volume firefighters.
It burns teams out completely. And critically, it totally prevents businesses from scaling. You cannot add new product lines or promise tighter delivery windows to your customers if your logistics function cannot guarantee basic network stability.
So the transactional model structurally caps a company's ability to grow.
Yes. You cannot build complex, value-added supply chain solutions on top of a foundation that shifts daily based on spot market pricing.
That brings us to a really critical pivot point in how we view this entire ecosystem. I mean, we've stripped away the difficult market smokescreen. We've mapped out how standard procurement KPIs often drive logistics teams right into the transactional trap, trading long-term stability for the illusion of short-term cost savings.
Right.
We've detailed the mechanics of that tender rejection cascade, and we've seen how this structural flaw just hides behind 1,000 daily frictions.
Yeah. And the synthesis of Greystride's research forces a really difficult realization here.
So, what does this all mean?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the reason these transport challenges feel permanent, the reason the delayed collections and vanished capacity just keep happening year after year, it is not because the South African logistics market is uniquely broken or incapable of improvement.
Because external market forces will always exhibit some volatility.
Always. The permanence of the problem lies entirely in the sourcing model. If you consistently use a transactional structure to secure transport, the output will consistently be transactional results. You will continuously generate unpredictability, volatile pricing, and endless administrative friction, regardless of who is physically driving the truck.
And that requires a fundamental paradigm shift for supply chain leadership. The transition has to begin by changing the metrics of success and the actual questions being asked at the executive level.
Exactly. The conversation must evolve beyond just asking why a specific transporter performed poorly on a specific day.
Right. The ultimate question Greystride poses to load providers is whether the core methodology you use to source capacity is actually actively manufacturing the exact instability you are spending millions of rand trying to eliminate.
Which is a tough pill to swallow. Recognizing that your own procurement structure is the root cause of your operational chaos, well, that's the first step toward genuine network resilience.
Yeah.
The volatility isn't bad luck. It is the logical, guaranteed output of a system that's designed to prioritize immediate cost over aligned mutual investment.
And that leaves you with a critical concept to really evaluate as you look at your own freight network and your own routing guides tomorrow morning. If the current transactional system is perfectly optimized to generate loss control, endless friction, and unpredictable costs, what would the alternative actually look like? What structural changes would be required to just step back, abandon the daily spot market battles entirely, and design a sourcing strategy engineered around long-term alignment, shared risk, and true operational predictability?
That is the structural leap required to stop managing movement and start mastering your supply chain.
Until next time, keep digging deeper.